يوم الأحد كان هو 14 شباط مرة أخرى.
Good afternoon and thank you for joining us on FutureTV. I'm Linda Tamim and these are today's top stories. MP Bahia Al-Hariri launches a campaign against violence in Tripoli, vowing to investigate recent clashes between the army and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Asir in Sidon. Islamists vow further protests to demand the military restore Egypt's first democratically elected leader. And the top two candidates for presidency of the Syrian National Coalition failed to gain the minimum majority of votes. Sidon MP Bahia Al-Hariri has launched a campaign against violence in Tripoli, vowing to uphold the law of the state and investigate recent clashes between the army and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Asir. Hariri said she launched the Enough Fear campaign because fear among people is the state's first sign of failure. The campaign's mission statement claims the right for civil peace within the states and calls for breaking a cycle of fear in order to build a nation that fulfills people's aspirations. Hariri voiced concern over Sidon and other cities that lack state control and called for an investigation about the bloody clashes in Habra last month. Tripoli has also been subjected to clashes for over 2 years due to tensions linked to the Syrian crisis. Saudi banks have expressed readiness to cooperate with security agencies and hand over the bank accounts and transactions of the people affiliated with Hezbollah. The Gulf Cooperation Council officials had met in Riyadh on Thursday to coordinate sanctions in the 6 member states against Hezbollah over its support for the Syrian regime. Despite that revealing bank accounts is considered prohibited, Saudi banks said they will cooperate unconditionally with the Interior Ministry in this regard, as the matter is related to the nation's highest interests and threatens national security. The GCC monarchies decided on June the 10th to impose sanctions on Hezbollah, targeting residency permits and its financial and business activities. The British government is preparing a substantial new package of military assistance to the Lebanese army to supplement its existing program. This is according to British diplomatic sources, which said the new package will triple in 1 year the British government's total military assistance to the Lebanese army since 2006. The aid was the focus of discussions between Army Commander General Jean Ahwaji and other top military officials, and General Sir David Richards, the British chief of the defense staff, who was on visit to Beirut. Details of the announcements have yet to be made public. Syrian warplanes have launched a series of strikes on the outskirts of Damascus as President Bashar al-Assad's regime pressed a bid to drive back rebels. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said fresh fighting also erupted in several flashpoint areas around the capital, while the army renewed its shelling on besieged rebel areas of the central city of Homs for a 7th day. Warplanes carried out several airstrikes on the edges of Asali in the south and Kabun in the east. Airstrikes also targeted other rebel areas east of Damascus, among them insurgent bastion Zamal'a. The observatory added the army intensely shelled the town of Khaldi. The Syrian opposition has voted to elect a new leader, but the top two candidates failed to gain a simple majority needed to become president of the coalition fighting to oust President Bashar al-Assad. A runoff ballot was scheduled for later today after Ahmed Jabra, a tribal figure linked with Saudi Arabia, and Mustafa al-Sabbagh, a businessman who is Qatar's point man, did not gain more than half of the votes in the 115-member Syrian National Coalition in an early morning ballot in Istanbul. The coalition is split into 3 power centers: the Muslim Brotherhood, the Sabbagh faction, and a Saudi-backed bloc that includes Jabra. The 3 factions held the vote for a new leader after failing to agree on a compromise candidate.
For the rest of the positions, which is the President, the Secretary General, and the 2 VPs, it was a very close contest, and neither of these got any more than 50% of the votes. So we are going for the second round, which will be held tomorrow at 10 a.m. On the president position, we have two people who qualified for the second round. That's Mr. Ahmed Asi Al-Jarba, number one, and Mustafa Sabbagh, number two. So it was very close contest, and it was very exciting, I think, for all the people involved. And it shows that, within the national coalition we have a lot of dynamism, and people would like really to, to cast their votes.
Moving on to Egypt, Islamists have vowed further protests to demand the military restore the country's first democratically elected leader after a night of ferocious clashes that killed 30 people and injured more than 1,100 nationwide. Supporters of President Mohamed Morsi said masses will continue their civilized protests and peaceful sit-ins in Cairo until the military coup is reversed and the legitimate president is restored. Despite the talk of peaceful demonstrations, residents in parts of Cairo reported seeing dozens of bearded Islamists armed with machine guns and sticks before the deadly clashes broke out last night. Snipers were spotted on rooftops, and medics told reporters they treated some residents of the neighborhood of Manyal for bullet wounds. Central Cairo was already tense ahead of today's new round of protests as protesters opposed to Morsi spent the night in Tahrir Square. The Egyptian ambassador to the United States, Mohammed Tawfiq, says the ouster of President Morsi was not a coup and says the Egyptian military had no option but to intervene to prevent escalating tensions in the country.
This was a situation in which the vast majority of Egyptians took to the streets. 22 million petitions were filled in, and all they asked for was early elections. They didn't ask for the military to take over. They asked for early elections. Now, President Morsi and his supporters, what they did is they mobilized, they stirred people's feelings up, and basically they encouraged their supporters to face the other demonstrators. So there was no option for the military and for the rest of Egyptian society but to intervene before terrible clashes and escalation would run out of control. When Morsi was elected president of Egypt, I was very hopeful. I really wished and I really hoped that he would succeed. And I did my very best personally to help him to succeed. But unfortunately, little by little, it became clear that he was unable to move from being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood to becoming the president of all Egyptians. And what we've seen in the past few weeks, that is the outcome of that. No arbitrary measures will be taken against anyone in Egypt. What we're trying to do in Egypt is correct our path. What our objective is full and complete democracy. We want respect for human rights. If somebody breaks the law, they will be dealt with in due process.
Senator John McCain calls for the U.S. to suspend aid to Egypt's military following the ouster of the country's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. McCain says the U.S. shouldn't support the removal of freely elected governments.
We have to suspend aid to the Egyptian military because the Egyptian military has overturned the vote of the people of Egypt. And we cannot set a precedent which frankly let me put it this way, we cannot repeat the same mistakes that we made at other times in our history by supporting the removal of freely elected governments. And so I believe that the aid has to be suspended, that the Egyptian military has to set a timetable for elections and a new constitution, and then we should evaluate whether to continue the aid or not.
The retrial of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak has been adjourned until August the 17th. After a brief hearing, Mubarak, 85, was brought into the cage dock sitting up in a wheelchair, wearing a white gown and sweater and familiar dark aviator glasses. The former Air Force general appeared alert and in fair health, while many Egyptians have lost interest in cases brought against their fallen dictator for opposition and corruption during his 30 years in power. Relatives of those who died in the crackdown in early 2011 have grown impatient with judges they accuse of being part of the old leadership. Mubarak, his two sons and other senior aides are being retried for complicity in the murder of more than 800 protesters, having successfully appealed against convictions handed down a year ago. Well, coming up next, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has decided to offer asylum to former U.S. intelligence contractor Edward Snowden. That and more after the break. Welcome back. A roadside bomb in Yemen's capital Sana'a has killed 3 soldiers and injured 2 others during a security patrol early today. A security official said the blast targeted a car in Sana'a's Hasaba district, a center of opposition to former Yemeni leader Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was ousted early last year. The official said it was unknown who carried out the attack. A source at the scene said one of the car's 4 passengers had survived the attack. Moving on to Nigeria, at least 29 students and 1 teacher have been killed in an attack by gunmen on the government secondary school in Mamudo town. Reporters on the ground say survivors are being treated for burn and gunshot wounds, and some students were burned alive in the attack early this morning. Parents complained there was no protection for students despite the deployment of thousands of troops since the government declared a state of emergency mid-May in 3 northeastern states. Dozens of schools have been torched and unknown scores of students killed among more than 1,600 victims slain by armed groups since 2010. And now for news around the world in brief, a deal has been reached to overcome the political crisis in the Portuguese government coalition, which is working through a €78 billion bailout program. This comes after the CDS-PP, junior partner of the government coalition, has met his national council to discuss the political solution in the country. Any deal will have to be approved by Portuguese President Cavaco Silva, who is due to meet political parties Monday and Tuesday. South Africa's ailing anti-apartheid hero and former President Nelson Mandela has spent his 29th day in a Pretoria hospital. There's been no update on his condition since the government described it as critical but stable last Thursday. Mandela is receiving treatment for a recurring lung infection in his 4th stay in hospital in 6 months. Exiled Tibetans celebrated the Dalai Lama's 78th birthday today with a Buddhist ceremony and traditional dances amid tight security. The celebrants sang Tibetan songs and performed traditional dances as they gathered at the Manang Gomba temple. The Dalai Lama is based in India and says he is merely seeking greater autonomy for his Himalayan homeland. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has decided to offer asylum to former U.S. intelligence contractor Edward Snowden, who has petitioned several countries to avoid capture by Washington. At a military to celebrate Venezuela's Independence Day, Maduro slammed the United States for offering asylum to Cuban exile and former CIA operative Luz Poseda-Scariles, who is wanted in Venezuela for the bombing of a Cubana Airlines jet that killed 73 people. Earlier this week, Venezuela's leader, part of an alliance of leftist governments in Latin America, said it was time to stop berating a man. On another note, Nicaragua says it has also received an asylum request for Snowden. President Daniel Ortega said his country could accept the bid if circumstances permit. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now, here's a reminder of our headlines. MP Bahia Al-Hariri launches a campaign against violence in Tripoli, vowing to investigate recent clashes between the army and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Assir in Sidon. Islamists vow further protests to demand the military restore Egypt's first democratically elected leader. And finally, the top 2 candidates for presidency of the Syrian National Coalition failed to gain the minimum majority of votes. That's it from me and the news team here at Future Television. We'll be back again tomorrow for what's making headlines in Lebanon and the world. Enjoy the weekend.
يوم الأحد كان هو 14 شباط مرة أخرى.